Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is March 31st, 2022, and it is my pleasure to have with me today the preeminent journalist and political analyst, Dalia Hatuqa. Dalia is a multimedia journalist specializing in Israel-Palestinian affairs and regional Middle East issues as they pertain to business, economics, culture, art, and U.S. foreign policy. She also writes about religion, minorities, immigration in the U.S., and other things. You should be reading her work if you're not doing so already. You can read it in major outlets around the world, including, and I'm just going to do a short list here because it's just so impressive, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, NPR, BBC, New York Review of Books, Economist, Time, The Nation, The Intercept, Jewish Currents, The Guardian, Al Jazeera. Okay, so you can read all about that, and you can see her bio and a compendium of her work at www.daliahatuqa, DALIAHATUQA.com. And maybe more important, if you want to keep up with what she's doing, you should do what I do and follow her closely on Twitter, and that is at Dalia Hatuqa, all one word, DALIAHATUQA. As you maybe can tell from my tone, I am a big fan, so I'm a little giddy to have Dalia here today. Dalia, thank you. I have wanted to get you on the podcast for ages. Basically, every time you read an article, I'm like, oh my God, I want to talk to her about that. And especially you have an article that came out recently, which was the impetus for me contacting you this time, looking specifically at internal Palestinian politics and succession. So I kind of want to start off there. And for folks who haven't read it, the headline of that article is Abbas is destroying democracy to ensure his successor supports Israel, which is really that's a heck of a thesis. And I'm going to read the final paragraph of that article, which reads, conspiracy may be too strong of a word to describe the political machinations playing out in the public stage. However, it is clear that Abbas's moves are meant to safeguard the political status quo in Palestine. And in a bitter reality for many Palestinians, part of that means securing a leader who is dedicated to protecting Israel. So let's start off with that article. I'd be interested in your thought process and why you thought it was important to publish this now, what your main points are in it, and what sort of discussion this is provoking.
First of all, thank you so much for that amazing intro. I'm honestly humbled. I'm likewise a fan of yours. So this article, I wrote it I want to say almost a month ago, February. And obviously because of what was going on in Ukraine, we kind of had to push it back. But the folks over at Foreign Policy were kind enough to, kind of keep it under the radar, and they wanted to get it published, especially because Mahmoud Abbas celebrated his 87th birthday, I believe, in I don't know, maybe a week ago. And so we kind of used that as a news tag. And but the thing that prompted it was something that happened on February 8th. There were these 3 Palestinian men who were assassinated by Israeli special forces in Nablus. And, Israel said that they were planning attacks against the citizens and that their killing was necessary. And but the killings themselves came at a time when the PA is under intense criticism from all sorts of Palestinians for maintaining security coordination with Israel. This kind of relationship has repeatedly facilitated the capture and killing of Palestinian fighters, whether they're wanted for attacks on Israeli soldiers or settlers. And the PA itself, I mean, they're in a situation where they obviously can't retaliate. They exist only so much as, Israel permits them to. And since even the mid-2000s, you probably, obviously know this, the PA has worked closely with Israel's intelligence and military to kind of crack down on not just Hamas, but other common enemies throughout the West Bank. So much so that Abbas at one point dubbed the security coordination sacred, which Palestinians, took note of. And Israeli forces often give their Palestinian counterparts a heads up before a raid. And this was the case in the killing of PA critic Nizar Banat. There was a major outrage about his killing by the hands of Palestinian security forces last year. But the killings also shed light on another important issue, which is Abbas is basically now consolidating power in like top political institutions of the PLO and the PA, which he heads, both of which he heads. And he's putting in his most trusted advisors, and they're basically men who are not, I would say, who are not like the most qualified to be in these positions. And this move that he made raised like eyebrows among, a lot of Palestinians. It reinforced fears that Abbas is paving the way for a trusted heir to take the reins following his demise. And like I said, Mazel Tov, he celebrated his 87th birthday. But the meeting where Abbas, did all this took place at something called the Palestinian Central Council, which is like an intermediary body between the Palestinian National Council, which is the legislative body of the PLO, and the PLO Executive Committee, which is the highest decision-making body of the PLO. Now, okay, the point is that the PCC hasn't met in about 4 years. And historically, it's had like a monitoring role, and it was never designed like as a forum to fill top positions in the Palestinian leadership. And so a lot of Palestinian factions denounced the move as basically a power grab, and it reinforced Abbas's control on what's supposed to be the last check on the PLO. And the session went ahead despite a boycott by like several Palestinian factions, the largest among them being, I believe, the PFLP, the Leftist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Throughout this article, I spoke to Mu'in Rabbani, who you probably know, renowned researcher, observer of the Palestinian scene, and he kind of like explained it this way. The way he said it is that the Palestinian National Council, by refusing to convene the Palestinian National Council and by holding the PCC meeting under Israeli occupation, which means that the diaspora, Palestinian diaspora, cannot be a part of this important decision-making forum. And by setting an agenda that Abbas knew would result in either the boycott or docility of those attending, Abbas ensured the meeting would be nothing more than a rubber stamp of personal decisions that he'd already taken. Like we knew that, renowned Palestinian leaders like Hanan Ashrawi, who had resigned from her position in the executive committee in December 2020, didn't participate. Others called for the boycott of the meeting. And the PCC ended its 2-day meeting really by doing something that it always does, which is recommending the suspension of first diplomatic recognition of Israel, and then ending security coordination with Israeli authorities. And no doubt their attempts to assuage intense pressure from the general public. And of course, nobody believes that the PCC recommendations are going to be carried out, because the PCC in 2008 made exactly the same recommendation, and the PLO Executive Committee, aka Abbas, didn't implement it. Now, the PA tried to sell the PCC meeting to the public as an opportunity to set a national agenda that would meet the current, political impasse. Like, Palestinians face a political stalemate, deteriorating economy, homes are being demolished, illegal Israeli settlements are expanding rapidly, expulsions of Palestinians in places like Sheikh Jarrah, continue to be a flashpoint, but nothing from the PCC meeting addressed any of these issues. Instead, what we saw is that Abbas used this meeting to appoint his right-hand man, Hussein al-Sheikh, to the PLO Executive Committee. Now, al-Sheikh, yes, he is a senior Fatah official, but he's never been part of the PLO, like the PLO machinations. I don't know what I want to say. He's never been part of the PLO the entire PLO umbrella. He's only been part of the Fatah situation, but he's slowly and kind of like been carving a name for himself as one of Abbas's closest confidants. Like, you see him everywhere, the Abbas is. And he's also been communicating and holding meetings with Israeli counterparts. And I think not just me, but a lot of people believe he's trying to pave the way for himself as a contender to succeed Abbas. The thing is Sheikh lacks popular support, but I also believe he's trying to take the role as senior negotiator Saeb Erekat, who from many years, and he died unfortunately from COVID complications 2 years ago. And to think of the two men, you can't help but wonder about the differences, and you definitely would not believe that Hussein al-Sheikh can replace Saeb Erekat. And this is probably a little inside baseball, but I'm sure that people who follow these issues would understand that there are some big shoes to fill there. The thing is with Sheikh is that he does seem to have the blessing of US officials. He does seem to have the blessing of Israelis. Like, he's met with Yair Lapid when he was still PA Civil Affairs Coordinator. He was also in charge of the office that provided Palestinians with work permits, and these are work permits to enter Israel. So he has a lot of power in that sense. But it's funny because he has also been meeting with European and US officials to kind of discuss bilateral relations and means to engage with Israel to revive the peace process. But in a way, he's also sidelining the Palestinian foreign minister, the prime minister, and the PLO and Fatah officials who are officially charged with international affairs. And it just seems that the primary reason for his elevation really is that, as Moin Rabbani said it to me, he's doing his master's bidding, and he's thoroughly subservient to him and his very whim. And it's also important that for Abbas, that al-Sheikh enjoys the support of Israel, the United States, and the Europeans. But anyways, at the bottom of it, what Abbas is doing, his power centralization, is eroding Palestinian democratic institutions. He's cementing his office as this autocratic base of operation, making it so much more difficult for Palestinian civil society to craft a representative political model in the future. Because if we've been following what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah and other places, there has been this attempt by Palestinian civil society to kind of create this alternative model to bypass Abbas and all these old goons and to create something different, because obviously they're not happy with the way things are happening, and the PA is a major obstacle to this. So the Palestinian street is aware that the PCC meeting was a gathering to benefit a few that have little to no legitimacy with the masses. They believe the PLO no longer represents the broad spectrum of Palestinians inside the occupied territories, and just as importantly, in the diaspora. I just saw a survey by Khalil Shiqaqi showing continued PLO loss of popular Palestinian support. I think there were only 51% of those asked were said that they see the PLO as their sole legitimate representative. And looking back at the PLO's history, that was the biggest thing. That was the raison d'etre of the PLO, to be the sole legitimate representative. And finally, I just want to say one thing. I spoke to one Western diplomat in Ramallah who attended part of the meeting briefly, and I quote this in the article, but they said that they felt that the meeting was like the death of the PLO, and putting in place those who don't enjoy popular support in the absence of any elections, seems like a pretty clear way of making the organization irrelevant over the long run. And they said that, basically the leadership is not doing a service to its people. And that was the diplomatic, way of putting it.
Yeah, I that is very diplomatic. I recommend people read the whole article. There's a lot packed in there, and you covered a lot of it. I think what was really striking to me reading it is how much it sort of highlights this tension between the idea of legitimacy and accountability from Palestinians and legitimacy granted by Israel and the international community. And the sense that there's not going to be elections, it appears, for the foreseeable future, if ever, again, for Palestinians. I mean, I remember years ago someone asking me about succession, someone in Congress asking about what the U.S. was doing about succession for the Palestinians. I'm like, well, aren't they supposed to have elections? That's the idea. But this idea that increasingly the leadership is leaning into the idea that legitimacy will be granted from the outside, and that is sufficient. I'm interested in whether or not you actually think that will be sufficient going forward, how you think that will, assuming at some point there is a succession, maybe going a step beyond your article, what are your feelings about what a succession will look like if the leadership is not its legitimacy is not derived from popular support necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is like one of the most important questions that people have. And the funny thing is that Abbas himself, like, constantly talks about the fact that he comes from a family that like always kind of lives beyond like the median age of what a Palestinian man should live. So he's quipped before that his father like lived until he was 100. So he's very much aware that people are like, okay, dude, time to go. But as he approaches the age of 90, I mean, the question of who will succeed him remains the most important issue in Palestinian politics. But his consolidation of power is made with an eye on the future, and his loyalists, the fact that they have the approval of Israeli and US intelligence and security establishments has immense consequences for the Palestinian cause's future. The thing is like, we've seen how Abbas and Saeb Erekat, like, for example, negotiated for years with successive Israeli administrations and came out with very little to show for their efforts. And instead, what we have is like, we have Abbas and the Palestinian political elite in his orbit. I mean, he has nothing to lose. This political elite is actually, things are working really well for them. So there is no kind of push or any kind of incentive for Abbas and the people around him to kind of change anything. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, like Arafat before him, Abbas made it clear that he's not going to name like a contender to succeed him. He seems very satisfied, like pitting, several officials with an eye on the throne against one another. And the free and fair elections, which you mentioned, which should be the sole determinant of a successor, now seem out of reach. Like, on and off for around, 15 years, Abbas called for national elections. The last one was in May. And even me, I was such a sucker. I was like, oh yeah, I can feel it. This time it's going to happen, And he postponed it. And he was obviously afraid of defeat by either Hamas in the West Bank, or I think more importantly, even rivals within his own Fatah faction. I especially like mention Nasser al-Qudwa, Yasser Arafat's nephew, whose movement was running against the official Fatah list in the called off elections. And I kind of appreciated this quip by him, wherein he said that, he built this like idea that the succession would be, arranged between 10 to 15 men, and they're all sitting in a dark room full of smoke, and he's like, that's not going to happen. That's not enough to lead to somebody presiding over the Palestinian people. He didn't think that was what was going to happen, but I could totally imagine this kind of scenario where you've got these guys all like chain smoking, be like, who's the next guy, And so honestly, finally, I would just say that at the end of the day, Palestinians want somebody who will represent them. And we have seen on the ground that Palestinian civil society and like, you know, even super young Palestinians like on social media and whatnot, like everybody wants to move away from this situation that Abbas has built, from this like little conglomerate, from everything that exists right now, because they've had enough. They believe that it's leading them nowhere. And while holding elections under occupation is like not ideal, obviously, but at the end of the day, it gives people a voice and it gives them an opportunity to kind of say what they need to say. And I think the first step, like moving on from here, is for Abbas to allow these elections to happen, because I know for a fact that, you know, the Europeans aren't happy, the Americans aren't happy. A lot of money is being pumped into the PA with very little to show for it, right?
Sneezing, it's allergy season in Washington DC. Sorry about that. I find myself thinking, you know, every time we talk seriously about elections. I was an observer for the last two Palestinian elections, and we know the last Palestinian election which was very free and fair, and the results of which were then absolutely repudiated by the international community. So there's that dicey piece of it as well, repudiated instantly by the international community. That's actually a good segue. There's three other things I want to ask you about. So we're going to be I want to be a little quicker because I don't want to take too much of your time. So there actually were some elections this week in Palestine, which people outside of Palestine maybe didn't even hear about. Can you talk a little about what happened and maybe some of the dynamics on the ground that were highlighted in these local elections?
Yeah, I think so. What's interesting and significant is the fact that so there were these Palestinian local municipal elections, so, you know, for municipalities. And the most interesting thing that came out of it really was that independent candidates dominated these elections. They won, I think, up to like 64% of the seats. And this was up from like 37% 5 years ago. So it's a huge deal in that sense. Of course, the polls came like after, as you mentioned, Abbas called off last year's planned presidential and legislative elections. He said, you know, it was because Israel barred voting from taking place in East Jerusalem, but we all know the real reason. And it's obvious from these elections also that there is frustration from Palestinian citizens towards the political establishment. So we're seeing a new level of activity in major cities by independent lists and groups, like around 70% of the lists are independent rather than affiliated with political parties. Now, some of these lists consist of genuinely independent political figures, but others like split from their own parties to run on their own. So in the city of Jericho, for example, which has been historically like a traditional Fatah stronghold, all 5 lists that were competing were independents. And generally, there seems to be an aversion to the existing political parties, and people are turning to new independent frameworks, which are not the classic parties, to kind of express their satisfaction. The funny thing is that Abbas on Sunday nonetheless claimed victory, saying the results demonstrated renewed confidence in Fatah, which really doesn't make much sense because the numbers and the observers tell us otherwise. And of course, Israel never helps in this situation. It meddles in the elections. Like, I think last week they arrested one of the candidates. I think his name is Islam al-Tawil. He was elected as mayor of Al Bira. He was running as head of an independent list called Al Bira Unites Us. And of course, it was under the guise that he's somehow affiliated with Hamas. I personally haven't seen any real evidence to that effect. So it just seems like really haphazard, and it just completely destroys like whatever advancement that Palestinians can make. But it's also believed that the PA had also pressured candidates in an attempt to kind of dictate the outcome of the vote. So the PA and its security forces like used cash and media ops in service of candidates who are in their pocket, and kind of pressuring some families like through familial ties not to nominate other potential candidates. But overall, I think what I want to say finally is that it's worth mentioning that the turnout overall was super low. Like the CEC, or the Central Election Commission, certified a final turnout of like 54%, even though this was held in like 50 cities and towns. But there was also no voting in Gaza, and we know that these past two rounds of local elections were held mostly because of European diplomatic pressure. And it just seems that the whole thing reeks of basically like Palestinians, either shrugging or, being like, okay, I'm going to vote for an independent because I'm sick and tired of Fatah and Hamas.
Right. I find these moments, things like local elections, a fascinating opportunity to gather some amount of empirical data about where people, how they're feeling about things. Turnout, then how much turnout there is empirical data, whether it's about apathy or disillusionment. The fact that so many of the candidates are independent, either believing that is more advantageous for them or out of a personal repudiation or whatever, I just think it's fascinating. And my understanding is also I think it's worth observing that according to observers, these were once again, the Palestinians know how to hold good elections, right? The CEC managed them. They were free. The voting was free and fair. It was overseen. The technical capability to hold free and fair elections remains intact, which is pretty extraordinary given how rarely Palestinians are allowed to have elections.
Absolutely.
So I want to actually shift gears to the current moment in broader political terms. And there's two things I want to talk about. And the last thing we're going to end with, and people listening to this podcast are thinking, when are they going to talk about the situation on the ground, which seems to be rapidly boiling over into something very scary and very dangerous. We're going to get to that last. The question I want to ask first, which maybe is not unrelated, is I want to talk to you about the summit in the Negev this week.
Yeah.
This was the great summit celebrating the Abraham Accords and the new era of peace between Israel and the Arab and Muslim world. I'm actually been waiting for an article from you about this. So since I haven't seen an article from you about this, tell us what you think.
Okay, so I mean, for Israel, Israel wanted to kind of frame this as like as the establishment of a regional front against Iran. This is what brought together like all these guys from, Israel, the US, Egypt, UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco. I think Jordan was invited but declined, and I don't think the invitation ever made it to the Muqata'a in Ramallah, and so they're trying to create the sense that there's a new regional like architecture based on progress, technology, religious tolerance, security, and intelligence cooperation. I think for Israel, Iran may have been the first and foremost issue, but that didn't appear to be the case for other participating countries, even though they are concerned about Iran. But the funny thing is, like, if you're watching the closing press appearance, they didn't mention Iran, or like did so, kind of nominally. I believe each country came kind of with a different priority. Maybe for the UAE, it might have been like investment in tech and clean energy. For Bahrain, maritime security. For Morocco, education and agriculture. For Egypt, it could have been all of these, including like the Ukraine war effect on global food prices, which has been affecting wheat, and not just in Egypt, but like worldwide. But the interesting thing is that the only like mention or allusion to Palestinians was when Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shukri expressed his country's support for a two-state solution, and he cautioned Israel against taking unilateral measures that might agitate the current situation. Meanwhile, the Palestinians are in this bizarre situation. They can't condemn this egregious act of normalization, but they can't exactly stay silent. So instead, the PA Foreign Ministry issued this like vaguely worded statement where it avoided condemning the Arab participants directly, but they warned them that Israel was using the meat to avoid dealing with the Palestinian issue, which is true. I mean, was the summit like historic or life altering in any way? Not really. There was an impressive photo op. There were discussions on topics of mutual interest. There was a commitment to meet again, but there were no clearly defined goals, no durable geopolitical objectives, and no discernible deliverables. And also like a regional summit that doesn't include Saudi Arabia and conspicuously ignores the Palestinians is futile, because I think at the end of the day, I mean, I don't just think that, who's going to live with the Israelis? It's us, the Palestinians, not the Moroccans, not the Bahrainis, not the Emiratis, you know? And I think it's notable that the summit just, you know, was, the notable thing about it was that simply that it took place, you know? And I think it projects like Israel's growing regional power. It sends a message of potential cooperation and conveys the appearance of a loose coalition that's unhappy, you know, with Iran. But the thing is, it also proves the argument that there's more to the Middle East from Israel's standpoint than the Palestinian issue. But this is really dangerously reckless. And this approach has been espoused by Israel in the past few years. More important than anything else at the summit was like, you know, the absence of a Palestinian delegation. And here's an inconvenient truth. A summit that ignores the Palestinians is a summit that ignores reality. It's that simple, because the Abraham Accords are not going to be a substitute to negotiating with the Palestinians. And Blinken said so. I believe he said something like regional peace agreements are no substitute to an agreement with the Palestinians. Like, he was very clear about it. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, none of these guys have to coexist and live with 5.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, but Israel does. And similarly, Jordan is also in a similar situation, and which is why King Abdullah chose to visit the PA in Ramallah rather than send his foreign minister to the Negev. So yes, the summit has value for Israel and the Arab states in attendance, but it also made a decision not to deal with the Palestinian issue, making the summit, at least in that sense, a failure.
Yeah, look, I mean, I will say, from having the speeches that I watched, I mean, it really felt more like a PR event than a summit. The summit is dealing with, you know, issues in business. The timing of it, though, is interesting, given where we are in the cycle with the United States, the international community, and Iran negotiations. But this now ties into the last thing, which is the situation on the ground between Israelis and Palestinians. The summit itself is I don't want to put words in your mouth. To my mind, the escalation on the ground, which everyone has been worrying about now for months as we approach the anniversary of last year's escalation, as we approach the confluence of Ramadan, Easter, and Passover. We have a surging settler violence in the West Bank. We have efforts to, I will use the term, ethnically cleanse parts of the Negev. We have efforts to ethnically cleanse the South Hebron Hills. All of this is ongoing in the background, and then this Negev summit happens, and now we're also seeing this outbreak. And I want to be very clear for people listening. When we talk about an escalation outbreak of violence, what that really means is it's now affecting Israelis too. Right? Because the violence has been ongoing for Palestinians this whole time. It's now affecting Israelis too, which now makes it news, and also and makes people concerned of where the further escalation will go. So I'm not asking you to do sort of a crystal ball and talk about exactly where you think it will go, unless you want to. But I would love your observations as someone who followed, obviously, very closely what was happening last year, and you wrote about it. You have expertise in the role of Jordan in all this. Jordan has always historically played a role in tamping down crises before they can get out of hand, or helping get them back under control. So do you want to just make some final observations about all of that?
Sure. So I think, like you mentioned, the trends on the ground, like what's happening right now, is really tied in with what we're seeing as this kind of renewed role being played by Jordan, because Netanyahu had sidelined Jordan for many years, and it took a toll on everybody and everything in the region. So yesterday, the Jordanian, was it yesterday? Could have been yesterday or the day before, Jordan's king met with the Israeli president in the first like high level but public reception of an Israeli official in years. And obviously it comes at a time where there are concerns over, you know, mounting tensions in Jerusalem and elsewhere this Ramadan, access to holy sites, the threat of extremists like taking advantage of the blocked path to peace, dialogue, or hope of improvement is both a common concern and a threat to Jordan itself. And the fact that the political space is closed with an iron fist in the West Bank and Gaza, and there's no traction towards negotiations from Israel is kind of seen as a combustible mix by Amman. And so that's why we've been seeing all these meetings, like Israel's defense minister met with Jordan's king in Amman. And they both made it clear that it was an effort to maintain calm in Jerusalem ahead of Ramadan. Benny Gantz meeting with Abdullah was his second this year. There were also like other meetings, low-level meetings. So Jordan is out there making a genuine effort to mediate, to engage, to ensure that last year's miserable events that culminated in a war on Gaza don't happen again. And Jordan is like the right party to do this because Israel and Jordan have maintained close security ties and they have diplomatic relations. But obviously these soured, like I mentioned, over tensions around Jerusalem's like flashpoint holy site, the expansion of West Bank settlements, the lack of any progress in the peace process. And so this kind of might be a good way or a good time to segue into the situation on the ground. Things are super intense. This isn't to say that things haven't been intense, like on average, a Palestinian is killed every few days and it hardly makes the news. We've got home demolitions, Israeli settler attacks, all these things happen and they are happening. Like since the beginning of 2002, I think there's been 51 Palestinians who've been killed. Today, I think 2 or 3 others were killed. Many of them were shot dead, but they're by Israeli forces, but there were others like, do you remember the case of the Palestinian American elderly man, Ahmad Asad, who was like killed under far more questionable circumstances. He suffered
a Palestinian American.
Yes, and he was 78 years old. He suffered a lethal heart attack after being bound, gagged, and abandoned in a half-constructed building by Israeli troops. And while a handful of like senior Israeli officials issued condemnations for the issue, Bennett wasn't one of them. And it kind of seems ridiculous that he wasn't part of these people, issuing condemnations, because Abbas himself was sent a stern message by Benny Gantz's office to condemn Tuesday night's deadly attack in Bnei Brak, right? And this is according to a report by the Times of Israel. What happened was 3 Israelis and 2 Ukrainians were killed by a Palestinian from near Jenin on Tuesday. And I guess the PA, like Jordan, is trying to calm things down as well, because this was also, this came after a series of attacks in Beersheba and Hadera the past week. So again, a lot going on, lots of killings. And Israel says that it's been pushing for like a series of moves to ease restrictions on Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza ahead of the holy month of Ramadan that begins either tomorrow or the day after. So they're aware that things are tense. They're aware that like the harder you squeeze, the less likely things are going to go your way. Things are combustible.
Just interrupt. Just also, 2 of the attacks, I believe, were committed by citizens of Israel.
Absolutely.
So can you address that aspect of it as well?
Yeah, that's an important point because it kind of erases the green line, the pre-1967 borders, and it just shows you that things can happen on either side of this imaginary line, and that should be something that I don't want to like put fear into people's minds, but this should be something that we should be concerned about. And I don't think the amount of like entry permits for elderly Muslim worshipers over 60 to pray at Al-Aqsa, or other measures aimed at easing freedom of movement for Palestinians are really going to do it. We all know this happens every single year, so we should learn, but we don't. And we all know that these are merely band-aids and that the issue is so much deeper. And Israel needs to take into account that not just when it's Ramadan, Easter, and a Passover, do you start thinking, oh, well, I shouldn't be building more settlements. I shouldn't, try to help facilitate the expulsion of Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah or whatnot. Again, permits, yeah, great, thank you for permits, but these are just band-aids, and the issue is so much deeper.
So I have like 100 more questions for you. I was actually just looking for a quote to run past you, but what I'd like to do, I want to end it here. We've hit our time limit. I want to tell you now that I want to have you back, because each one of these questions I think we could have devoted an entire podcast to, and I want to dig into this more. It is my fervent hope that I do not have to invite you back in a few months to talk about the 2022 war. It's difficult to see right now what the off-ramp is. For folks who are watching the news, Israelis are terrified, Palestinians are terrified, and civilians should not have to live in terror for their lives and their safety and the safety of their children. That applies to both Israelis and Palestinians. The violence that we've seen, the targeting of civilians inside the Green Line is horrific. The responses that we've seen in terms of more West Bank settler violence aimed at Palestinian civilians is horrific. And the kind of noises that we're hearing from the Israeli political echelon suggesting in effect that, all Palestinians, whether they're citizens or not, are enemies and terrorists. And of course, today we had the visit to the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif by a Kahanist member of the Knesset who is absolutely views basically all Palestinian citizens or not as a fifth column that must be eliminated. So it feels like all the pieces are in place for things to get worse. It isn't clear what path might emerge as an off-ramp, but I desperately hope there is one. But regardless, I hope to have you back so we can talk about whatever is next in the news. I want to thank you, Dalia, for giving us your time this morning, and I want to thank our audience. Thank you for listening or watching. Don't forget to follow Dalia on Twitter @Dalia Hatuqa. If you're not doing that, you are certainly less educated and have less understanding of what's going on, so please do. And finally, as always, I want to remind everyone to subscribe to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. You can do that on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and that way you won't miss any of the great content that we are posting pretty much every week. And you can also find this podcast and a video of it on our website. And I'll include with that the link to Dalia's website and some of the most recent articles that we discussed today. So with that, we'll end this. I'm Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.